On a night when the moon hid its face, and the air in the slave quarters tasted of sweat, soot, and boiled collard greens, the sound of rain on the tin roof mixed with a chorus of low voices and the scent of tobacco and cassava bread, and the small room seemed to hold its breath before a secret broke loose. What you will hear now is the truth that the plantation ledger and the polite society of the county preferred to erase. It was the year 1849 on the Whitfield plantation, a spread of sugarcane and cedar fences where the big house shone like a promise, and the quarters crouched in the long shadow of that promise. Sarah, a woman whose hands bore the maps of hardship in calluses and scars, worked by day in the kitchen and by night kept watch over secrets like they were embers in her palm. Her face, when seen by the white world, was polite and low, but inside her chest a storm gathered that no prayer had been able to calm. Everything changed the night she found the letter, hidden beneath the loose floorboard near old Ruth's bed, a scrap of paper that would name what the mistress did to them in the dead of night. If this story holds your attention, press like and subscribe to follow this chapter and the next, because the truth that follows is smaller than a scrap of paper and louder than the courthouse bell. The first sound of the change was a whisper, then a rustle, then a name written in ink that trembled like flesh. The letter was folded 3 times, its edges smeared with sweat and wax, and when Sarah read it by the light of a stolen tallow candle, the room smelled suddenly of iron and of a fear older than the plantation itself. She did not know then that a single sheet would set families drifting like loose leaves, would make eyes that had learned to look away start to see, and would force a master to choose between reputation and the rope of his conscience. The big house stood on a low rise, its white columns catching the sun like the face of the Lord, and beneath it the quarters were a knot of small rooms, low doorways, patched roofs, and a patchwork of stories. Colonel Whitfield presided over fields and ledgers with a hand that was patient and severe, a man who read the paper of human beings as property and read the Bible as annotation to property. His wife, Mistress Eleanor, moved through the rooms with a perfume that mixed rose and camphor, her skirts rustling like dry leaves, and a smile that taught the servants to steady their eyes and lower their voices. The overseer, James, walked the cane rows with a strap at his belt and a ledger in his back pocket, and men like Elijah and Thomas bent to the rows at dawn with a rhythm their shoulders learned before they learned the alphabet. Old Ruth, who fed babies and kept herbs, carried the memory of places where purchased people had prayers that tasted of smoke and sugar. Pastor Gabriel took the church steps with soft shoes and sermons that named sin but rarely named power. And Judge Avery in town kept the papers tidy that made a legal world of persons into things. It was in this lattice of duty and small violent courtesies that Sarah learned to move like a shadow, to answer yes, mistress, even when the tongue inside her felt like stone. The household had rituals of presence and absence, a way of naming time by the ringing of the bell and the opening of shutters, and under those rules the smallest act of disobedience looked monumental. When the first indignation rose, it did not come from a public square, but from a hand passing a note under a door, from a whispered agreement between women in the wash-house, from a bruise that could not be explained away as an accident. The moral logic of the plantation required silence, but there was a law of bodies that did not obey scrolls and sermons. The encounter that lit the whole chain happened beside the cistern one dusty afternoon, where the water gleamed and the air tasted of citrus and mud. Thomas was a man who mended nets and told stories of a river where he once swam, his voice low and the pack in his shoulders a map of roads he had not taken. He had come from the fields with a basin and 2 cracked cups, and Sarah was carrying a wooden bucket that hit her palm with a dull ache. They saw each other in the tilt of light, and the world narrowed to the sound of their steps and the scrape of a gourd. "You carry too much," Thomas said, offering at once to hold the bucket and to undo a weight that bent more than her back. "Let me," he said. Sarah felt the basin cool under his hand, and something inside her shift like a loose seam. "You always let others go first," she replied, and for once her voice did not move to the usual smallness. He smiled, a slow gathering of warmth, and answered, "Only when others have something to hide. What is it you hide today, Sarah?" There were 8 heartbeats audible then, as they exchanged words that were more like probes, the conversation widening and deepening. "Ruth says the mistress asked her to mend a dress with a seam she will not show anyone," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "Ruth says she saw her go to the servants' wing at night," Sarah murmured. "Do you think she took some of them?" Thomas asked, eyes dark with fear and question. "I think she takes what she pleases," Sarah answered, "and what she pleases is never a fair accounting." "We could go to Pastor Gabriel," Thomas suggested, cautious, "and be brought back to the plantation, or to the overseer," Sarah cut him off, "and have them say she is a woman of piety and that we imagine things." "No." "Then what do you want to do?" he asked. Sarah looked at the cistern water reflecting the bare sky, at their faces, at the way the light made truth look almost beautiful. "We hide the truth until we can speak it where it will not be swallowed," she said. "We write it, we keep it, we place it where even a man with power might tremble at its reading." Their hands briefly touched while she passed him the empty cup. A stifled laugh from a child in the distance, the faint creak of a gate, the smell of cooked cassava and a distant bell kept the world steady outside their confessional. In that conversation, the promise of action formed, and between them and the world there opened a small but certain choice, spoken in 8 to 10 exchanges that carried weight like stones to be thrown into still water. Their voices carried detail, the rasp of a sleeve against skin, the quick swallow when a name was dangerous, the taste of salt on apprehensive lips. The scene offered 5 senses in quick succession: sight in the glint of water, hearing in the hush of their talk, smell in the kitchen smoke nearby, touch in the passing of the cup, and taste in the stale bread they carried for the day. A second relation took shape in the quiet of the wash-house when Sarah read the letter aloud to old Ruth and to Elijah, who came in leaning on a wooden cane. The letter was in a hand that trembled, signed with a name no longer permitted to be named in polite conversation. For Sarah, the backstory of who she was and how she came to be at Whitfield had always sat under her ribs like a stone, and it needed telling now because it connected to the rage the letter awakened. She had been taken from a village by a man with a ledger, a man who offered rum and paper as if life could be traded. As a child, she had learned to braid hair and to hide bruises under laughter. She had learned songs that said goodbye in syllables she kept to herself. In the years that followed, she worked in 3 kitchens and learned how to carve a roast, how to tend to fevered limbs, and how to listen without letting your eyes speak. The second paragraph of her history bore the trauma that made her steady in crisis. Her mother had been sold for debt, her brother shipped south, and she had been promised manumission once for delivering a fine son, and then told that promises were like sugar, sweet until they were sold. Now, in the present, she harbored a small, stubborn hope, the kind that grows around a shared loaf. Thomas had his own fragment of past, a river that tasted of fish and a sister who hid letters in reed baskets for fear they would be burned. These backstory fragments, written in 2 concentrated sections, tied directly to why the letter mattered. It was not an abstract wrong. It was the only thread left to the families who might be torn by sale and rumor. In the wash-house, where the steam rose like prayer, Sarah's voice cracked and mended, and the room smelled of boiled linen and lemon, and each listener bore a name and a reaction. There were at least 5 other people in the compound who heard the reading in the days that followed, names that anchor this story and that will appear across it, people like Ruth, Elijah, Thomas, Pastor Gabriel, and Overseer James, and more who will be named as they act. The third relationship brings a reversal of power when the mistress discovers the whisper that had spread like root among the quarters. The night she realized that a scrap of paper carried accusation she did not expect, Mistress Eleanor walked the corridor with a candle, her silks whispering and the house smelling of lavender and ink. She had a public face of fragile devotion and a private hand that exercised authority in ways the law did not record. In a scene of quiet that grows erotic and then cruel, she called Sarah to the parlor under the pretense of mending a shirt, and then held conversation that was half compliment and half command. "You are a clever girl," Eleanor said, circling Sarah like a cat. "You listen, you notice," she added, touching the curl at Sarah's temple with a glove that smelled of rose. Sarah felt warm where the glove brushed her skin and cold in the places the touch did not reach. "I only do my work," Sarah answered, steady. "You do more than work, my dear," the mistress said, and there was a bowl of cherries on the table, and the sound of a clock that marked too loudly. The unease turned into a test of power that blurred lines of consent and shame. "If I were to reward loyalty," Eleanor said, "what would you ask?" Sarah swallowed. For a moment, pleasure and horror were tangled, guilt sliding with a sweetness that felt illicit and dangerous. "I would ask for nothing that would undo someone else," Sarah managed. The mistress leaned close, voice low. "Then loyalty shall have its price." The scene detailed sensory impressions, the taste of fruit, the silk against the skin, the hush of the parlor, the chime of the clock, the metallic tang of fear in the mouth, and it moved the moral ground beneath Sarah. Pleasure and violation were not separate, they overlapped and left a bruise both visible and secret. In that exchange, the power dynamic inverted and then collapsed into a form of control that would be used to keep mouths shut and provide plausible deniability. The discovery that followed was public in its consequences and private in its cruelty. Someone found the letter under Ruth's board, and the news moved through the quarters like heat through iron. Accusations were made in the hush after chapel, and at first people spoke in fragments, in questions that trembled. "She took Mary at night. Did you see the mistress go to the servants' wing? Who wrote this?" The social machinery responded with the names it knew best. Overseer James called Sarah to the yard and asked for explanation, his voice dry as sawdust. Colonel Whitfield, who had kept the plantation books and his reputation like separate things, suspected scandal and in panic sought to preserve the public narrative. The first high-tension moment unfolded like this, slowed into 2 paragraphs that held the decision like an animal between hands. Sarah stood before a group that included Judge Avery, who had come to mediate reputation, Pastor Gabriel, who kept his hands folded, but whose eyes searched for sin, and Mistress Eleanor, who approached with the composed face of someone who has practiced scandal. The scene lasted long enough that sweat cooled on foreheads and the smell of wet earth from the recent rain mixed with the sweetness of the magnolia that shaded the yard. Voices rose, became clipped, then blunt. "You confess," Judge Avery said with a pen poised. "I am the property here," Sarah replied, "and my voice costs me more than paper." The second high-tension moment centered on the choice Colonel Whitfield made when confronted with the letter, as he weighed a scandal that would ruin his social standing against the ruin of those he called his own. He chose preservation. "Keep your house," he told the church in the court, "and there will be no dishonor." The decision to silence was enacted with a contract and a threat, and it had immediate consequences. The third high-tension moment came when the punishment was handed down, when 2 men were sold at market, and when Sarah was sent to the wash-house to mend not only linen but the narrative of the house, the beat of the overseer's rule a metronome for their lives. The punishment was graphic in moral terms, public shaming, the sale of kin, the reduction of a story into an accusation to be stamped out. Each of these moments was slowed and lingered over, 100 details sketched in small, careful strokes that made the punishment palpable. At about this point, pause and let me ask you, as you watch, how would you have acted in Sarah's place, knowing that any outcry could unmake more than one life, and that silence could allow continued harm? Start your comment with, "I think that Sarah should," or "I think she should not," and tell us why a single letter should make us re-examine how we value truth over reputation. Your comment helps others see the complexity of choices. In impossible circumstances, it builds a space for dialogue about memory and justice, and it supports a community that cares for the voices of those who were forced into silence. Now we return to the chain of events, to the small decisions that became a verdict. The fallout moved through months like a slow tide. People were named and sold. Names that had been part of morning prayers were erased from the ledger and replaced with inventory numbers. Thomas and Elijah plotted quiet exits and whispered of running to the river and crossing it into a place where a new name might stick. Ruth kept the space under her floorboard empty and the letter hidden in her mattress, and she chewed the edges of the paper like one chews bitter herb to keep awake. There were more characters who played a role and who deserve naming, minor voices that when combined create a chorus of resistance and complicity, such as Mary, who turned witness for a moment and then retracted; Samuel, the stable boy, who overheard and grew mute; Hester, the midwife, who knew how power could terrorize bodies; and Captain Reed, who came from town and made offers that smelled of coins and contracts. These people moved the story into the courthouse, into the kitchen, and into the hush of the riverbank. Dialogues occurred in low voices and in the open, 8 or more times, in scenes that asked what justice looked like when courts belonged to those who would lose little if a family was broken. The epilogue comes in 2 parts and stretches across time to show consequences that are concrete and cutting. 1 month later, the plantation felt smaller and meaner. Colonel Whitfield had his name intact in the papers, yet at the market people looked at him in a new way, as if his ledger now bore a stain that would not be scrubbed. Sarah kept her place in the kitchen, but moved more deliberately. The easiest chair in the yard passed from one person to another. Old Ruth would sit for longer and tell stories that began with, "Remember when the moon hid itself?" and the children listened. Thomas left one night, slipping beyond the hedgerow with a small bundle and a river to guide him, and the rumor of his crossing became an act of hope. 6 months later, there were ripples that reached beyond the plantation. A petition in town, bearing the signatures of a few brave names, Pastor Gabriel's sermon that no longer omitted mention of responsibility, and a small trial in which the mistress was publicly questioned changed the tenor of local conversation. Names that had been whispered were spoken aloud, and some restitution was arranged, not in full measure, but in gestures that mattered. The letter survived in the town archive for a generation, a brittle thing that historians would later cite as evidence that private harm had public consequence. Those who were named regained parts of themselves. Some found work in other houses, some left and never returned, and the big house itself, when Colonel Whitfield died, fell into disrepair and was eventually sold off in lots. The final image is of Sarah, years later, standing by a river that felt like the old stories, her hands free, her name spoken by children who did not know the weight that name once carried, and the memory of the letter folded now into the stable spine of community truth. If this account moved you, subscribe to our channel to follow other narratives that unearth voices that history tried to bury, and share this story so that it travels beyond the plantation and prompts more questions about how we honor memory and seek justice.